You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining this special edition of the American Revolution. Earlier this month, our live roundtable was joined by Evelina Balestri, the author of Gone for a Soldier, the first book in her trilogy, All Ye That Pass By. Now, these books focus on a fictional British officer who must first come to terms with being a Catholic in Protestant England, and then after converting to Protestantism, joining the fight in America. Her first book begins in England and ends during the Saratoga Campaign in upstate New York in 1777. Ms. Balestri joined us for our live roundtable discussion, meaning that participants are able to ask questions. Some of the listeners type their questions into the comments section, others ask their questions live. So sometimes you'll hear me reading the question, other times you will hear one of the listeners asking their questions directly. This event was recorded live on Zoom. If you'd like to join us on future roundtables, be sure to sign up for my mailing list for notifications, or you can become a sponsor on Patreon. What follows is a recording of our discussion. We're joined tonight by Evelina Balestri, who is the author of Gone for a Soldier, which is the first book in a trilogy, All Ye That Pass By. It's a work of historical fiction that is set in part, at least, in the American Revolution. In America, I know a lot of it takes place in England as well. Evelina, hi. It's great to see you. Do you want to start maybe by just giving us a brief outline of your book and what it covers?
Sure. So my book is the first in a trilogy. The trilogy is called All Ye That Pass By, and the first book is called Gone for a Soldier. And it follows the story of Edmund Southworth, who's called Ned for most of it, and he is a young man from a Catholic recusant family in the north of England. Recusants were those who refused to take the various religious test acts, which basically gave allegiance to the Church of England, offered membership to the Church of England, essentially, and acknowledged the king or queen's supremacy within the Church of England. Catholic recusants were those Catholics who refused to take those test acts. And you had other types of recusants as well. There were various Protestant dissenter groups who also wouldn't take these oaths for various reasons. So you had a situation in the case of my character and his family where they actually come from an old noble family. Even they used to be very well connected and so forth. But over the years, since the split of Henry VIII from the Catholic Church, they have had to deal with just a constant press of fines and laws passed limiting their freedoms to the point where their influence, their power, and their finances are basically broken for the most part. And so they live in a very curtailed situation. They still have their manor house, but it's broken down. There's just a bare bones skeleton crew running anything. They're only hanging on by a thread because really technically they shouldn't even be able to own land. But it was common for certain areas where the Catholic population was a little bit higher. Oftentimes local authorities would kind of turn a blind eye so as not to upset the apple cart too badly and not to kick up sectarian violence. So they kind of are allowed to exist, but just barely. And then the story really gets going when Ned's father, Francis, dies, and it's revealed just to what extent they are in debt. They are in a really bad rut, and it looks like they're going to lose the house. They're going to lose whatever they've managed to salvage at the end of all of this. Into this situation comes a historical character, General John Burgoyne. So he comes from Lancashire ancestry, comes from Lancashire roots, his family. And he ultimately, historically, does represent a part of Lancashire, the city of Preston, the township back then of Preston, in Parliament. And basically, he is very much aware of the politics of Catholics and Protestants in that part of England. And this is true of historical Burgoyne. He had some sympathy. I say this with very much of caveats because he was anti-Catholic too. Everybody was, in this time period. It was very much of a thing to be among, Protestants of the Anglosphere. It was extremely, extremely common. Even so, he was more sympathetic. He had more of a sympathy toward Catholics. He wanted there to be relief acts for Catholics, because Catholics couldn't do any number of things. They couldn't vote, they couldn't serve in office, they couldn't join the military, they couldn't serve at the bar, they couldn't, I mean that in a legal sense, they couldn't, do any number of things pertaining to weaponry ownership, or in some cases even horse ownership. I mean, this is an interesting real life story that I do bring up within the book, that General Thomas Gage came from one of the most famously Catholic families in England. They hung in with the Catholic faith for generations after the split, but ultimately Thomas's father and his father's cousin cave, and according to family tradition, it was because the government said, we're going to confiscate your horses. That was like the final straw, but like they said, mostly it was a pretext, it seems, where they just decided we want these various benefits that come: a seat in parliament, better access to monies, better access to titles, all kinds of things you're going to get as an Anglican, you're most certainly not going to get as a Catholic. So that does seem to be what their decision was. So all this just to wrap around, that Burgoyne comes into Ned's life, and it turns out that Burgoyne was lent money by Francis, even though Francis had so little. He had been, when Burgoyne himself was in a tight spot, because Burgoyne, he was a wine, women, and song man. He was very much of a man about town, shall we say, and he got himself into all sorts of financial scrapes. He came in and went out of money constantly throughout his life. So when he was in one of his scrapes, due to a pileup of situations, Francis lent him money that he had requested. And so now Francis has died, and Burgoyne comes back around when he's had some luck at the card tables, and he helps them. He helps them save the house, and he helps them stabilize a little bit financially. And he takes Ned, who's now 18, this is the son of Francis, under his wing, and takes him touring in London, where Ned will meet a number of people who do become involved in the American Revolution, or just, are in our consciousness as being connected to it. So ranging from General Gage, Major John Pitcairn, Earl Percy, who's not an earl yet, but, Colonel Hugh Percy. He meets them at this party in London, which turns out the king himself makes sort of a guest appearance at, so he also meets George III briefly. So he's getting plugged into and connected to things he never has before as a recusant Catholic. Essentially, for about half the book, it's a build-up. Ned's situation in England as he's learning about things going on, but he is at first quite distant from it in terms of things going on across the sea in the colonies. The most connection he really has to the colonies is that he knows some of his distant cousins moved over to Maryland back when the colony was first founded. It was a Catholic colony founded by Lord Baltimore for the purpose of giving Catholics safe haven. It was under basically the auspices of Queen Henrietta Maria, who was the French Catholic princess that married King Charles I. It was named Mary's Land, Maryland, in part in honor of her, because her middle name is Maria, but in large part due to the Blessed Virgin Mary. It was very much of a Catholic wink wink thing. So basically he knows about the colonies to that extent, but he's not like really keeping up with politics over there or anything like that. He's got enough of his own problems. But then as things start to intensify, he's reading more about it in the gazettes and the newspapers and things that are news that are slowly trickling into England. And he is becoming increasingly concerned as people he knows start to be pulled into this thing, and starts to wonder, is this thing actually becoming another civil war? Because that's kind of a big concern. These are people, I think sometimes it gets a little bit forgotten, who have, many of them, either lived through civil wars or still had very immediate sort of ancestry who lived through civil wars in the British Isles that affected the colonies. So, for example, the English Civil War had immediate effects upon the colonies. The Glorious Revolution had immediate effects upon the colonies. The Jacobite rebellions that come in the aftermath of that affected the whole of the British Isles, and then ultimately did affect the colonies in terms of having a lot of Jacobite either exiles or indentured servants, who prisoners essentially being sent over there. So all of these civil wars are affecting the whole of the British Empire and the Anglosphere, and there's a real understandable fear among so many people of it happening again. They're trying to get stability back within the empire and so forth. So Ned is fearful just in the sense of nobody really wants another bloodbath. These things were extremely bloody. So there's that fear. There's the fear of, again, people going over there who he knows now at this point and fretting over them, particularly when Burgoyne ends up going over there in May of 1775 to Boston, and where he witnesses Bunker Hill, where Major Pitcairn is going to get killed. And again, this was someone that Ned met in London. After some other additional things in the storyline we cover, like the death of Burgoyne's wife, Charlotte, who was someone that Ned had connected to as well. He'd connected to both the Burgoynes. Basically, what you end up with is a situation where Burgoyne now in early 77, so we fast forward to time a bit, he's come back and forth between England and the colonies. And now he's back with his new plan. And his new plan is what's going to become the Saratoga campaign. And he gets it, amazingly, I might say, he gets it greenlit by the government. And so now he's coming to Ned and he's saying, hey, would you come with me on my staff? He wants to get him into the military and take him on this, what he considers to be a great opportunity for a career starter, which was the way this was presented to many a young man, and many a young man from a high-ranking family, too. There's one comment that was made from a contemporary at the time that Burgoyne's whole campaign had destroyed the flower of the English gentry. So this was, quite a lot of young men. I mean, the percentage, they said, of officers was very, very high from the ages of between 16 and 19. So that's pretty terrifying when you start to think about it. So Ned, when he's presented with this opportunity, now Ned, in his heart of hearts, since he was a little boy, he had a certain idealistic or romantic notion about being an officer with the scarlet coat and the brass buttons. But, he knows as a Catholic, he's not going to be that thing. It's forbidden to him. But at this point, the temptation increases because he doesn't want to be a coward at best or be seen as a traitor at worst. So a bunch of other things happen, but suffice to say, he eventually breaks down and he takes the Test Act to go on the Saratoga campaign, what's going to become the Saratoga campaign, what Burgoyne's March. So this is how he gets into the war. And he ends up with Burgoyne on Burgoyne's staff as a staff officer, becomes a lieutenant, and heads over, lands in Canada, and they do the whole preparations in Canada for the war, where we get to meet other characters for the first time, like General Simon Fraser of Balnain and General William Phillips of the artillery, and various other characters, Major Ackland. I mean, there's a lot of different historical characters I try to lace in to the story, and then they head south, and this is Burgoyne's March and sort of how it unfolds.
I'm kind of curious about the Catholic angle of this whole thing. I mean, I'm used to there being a lot of Catholics in Scotland and Ireland at this time. I didn't think there were a whole lot left in England. Is this a significant portion of the population at this time period, or?
It's a minority, but it's at its height in Lancashire, the county where Ned is from. So in the north, they were at their highest. I mean, this is true of Scotland as well. In Scotland, Catholics were also a minority, but they were at their highest in the north, in the Highlands of Scotland. So just like kind of in the Highlands of Scotland, they were at their highest. The same goes for Catholics in England. They were at their highest portion in the north of England. But you did have Catholics elsewhere too. I mean, obviously the Gages, who had been, again, famously Catholic, were not from the north. They were a southern noble family with a lot of history and a lot of ancestry. I mean, they'd been in almost every major conflict in English history. their name. Well, so many names in these cases, when you think of names like Burgoyne and Gage, etc., many of them, they're Norman names. You can tell kind of the French influence on these names. So they have ancestry going all the way back to the Norman conquest of 1066. The Catholics were around. They were a minority, but they were around. English Catholics had not been entirely eradicated. So we were still around.
And I mean, as you note, I mean, they lacked very basic rights, like the right to own property and things like that. I mean, sure, they couldn't vote, but yeah, 95% of the people couldn't vote, so that wasn't. But
well, it was more to the point with the not being able to vote. And again, as you say, majority of people couldn't vote, which is something that actually comes up when it comes to conservative rebuttals, actually, of sort of more, I guess you might say, liberal views being held in Parliament, like the Conservatives versus the Whigs. You can see that argument being made when it comes to the colonial demands for representation, where they're like, well, you know what? Hey, look, most people don't have representation, which is very true. I would say, though, that for noble families, you see, and these high-ranking families, they're as old as England herself, practically. The idea that they can't have a voice is a lot worse than somebody who doesn't have that kind of history. For them, it's a major, major point of pride. And it's the same thing with regards to not being allowed to ride or to hunt, that kind of thing, or to bear arms. It's a slap in their ancestral face. It's really intense for them. It's humiliating. And that's why the government did it. They were trying to specifically humiliate these big families, because the big families were the ones enabling, and I make a point of making this clear in the story, but the big families were the ones enabling Catholics of lower degree to be able to keep out of debtor's prison. Catholics who were of less monetary position were toast if they didn't have a Catholic upper class person and family covering their expenses. They were toast. So these big families, they would see it as their obligation, really, and you'd be considered a bad person if you didn't pay for your fellow religionists and their taxes. So you see that across the board. And when a noble family caves and takes the act or whatnot, that means that all of these people who depended on them are either going to end up in jail, or they're going to have to give up their faith, will cave and give up their faith as well. And the government knew that, and that's why the government tried to pressure noble families, particularly, to try to make the whole domino effect go down the line. And I mean, there were so many different things that Catholics were prevented from. Again, like, for example, as we're saying with the noble families, they couldn't attend universities, these prestigious universities and so forth, that ironically, of course, were founded by Catholics. So the whole thing gets very, very, just sort of unfair to the extreme. But it was a situation, where the temptations were so high to just cave at a certain point. So the people who held on long term, I mean, quite amazing. And when you think of so these old families, of course, they were, you go back to a certain point, they were all Catholic. The Percy family,
the entire country was Catholic until Henry VIII.
The entire country, exactly.
Yeah.
And the entire country, exactly. The whole of the Isles, the whole of Europe, everything. Not the whole of Europe, because obviously you had the Eastern Europe, splitting towards Orthodoxy, but most of Western Europe, point being. But yeah, and so these families, though, they get really, really famous. They get, they make marks within English history going back so far. When you think of, like, for example, the Percy family, another family that think of in the American Revolution through Hugh Percy, they were pretty famously Catholic, a northern family up to a point, and then they caved. But they had famously been involved in multiple northern uprisings, both in protest of Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries. This was famously associated with the banner of the 5 wounds of Christ. So there was a banner in which you had 5 wounds depicted, and anybody who actually had that banner was at risk of being executed for treason. But yeah, so Catholics in the 18th century, you don't have the same type of executions going on, but they still have a lot of disabilities, and things can change on a dime in terms of their safety. There's still a lot of mob violence that can break out. There's still just a lot of stuff that can go due south, not to mention prison sentences that could, depending on what you had done, or what you'd been accused of doing, You could find yourself landed in prison for the rest of your life, which might be quite short in the prison conditions of this time period. I mean, priests within the country were still almost always forbidden, except for a few rare exceptions. So yeah, there was all layers of manner of things, but you still did have priest holes in effect. Point is, so back in the Elizabethan period, you had priest holes, secret dwelling places, secret hideaways that were built into mostly these larger manors. Again, the noble families who held on to the faith were absolutely vital to keeping it alive, and so they would be the places that masses would be held in secret. They would hide the priests, etc., and then people who were Catholics, again, of lesser financial means, they couldn't afford to, they didn't even have the building spaces to necessarily have these things built in, would go there, and they would have their whole signaling history of linen on the hedgerows and so forth. Used to be a signal to people to come and see where a mass was being held, and so on and so forth. So a whole long heritage to this that goes into making Ned who he is. I mean, right down to the fact that he's named Edmund after two martyrs. That's kind of how the book opens, where we say Edmund Southworth was named after two martyrs. The two martyrs are one, Edmund the Martyr, Saint Edmund the Martyr, who was considered most popularly prior to George the patron saint of England, particularly. So not all of Britain. Like, again, Alban was the proto-martyr of all of Britain, but Edmund was the patron of England. And he was an Anglo-Saxon king who got martyred by invading Norsemen, Vikings, because he refused what was being offered to him by the Vikings, was essentially, if you will become our puppet king, essentially, and you will pour libations to our gods, then we'll let you live and we'll let you have your little bit of piece of the pie. And so Edmund has some awesome lines where he's just essentially like, no, you offer me a kingdom, which I already have. You offer me riches, which I do not need. You offer me my life, for which I no longer care. No, I'm not going to do it. And so he gets executed. He gets beheaded as well after being shot up. And legend has it they throw his head into a nearby woods, and it's protected by a wolf. And this has significance because at the time, wolves were the signet of the Anglo-Saxon people of his line. Wolves were their symbol. And this comes into my story later on, because the second book is called Kingdom of Wolves, and there's a bunch of interplay with that. But that was the first St. Edmund. The second St. Edmund is St. Edmund Campion, one of the martyrs of the Elizabethan persecution, one of the Jesuit priests, who was called the Diamond of England. He was a great scholar and teacher prior to essentially reverting to the Catholic faith. So technically he was born and slightly raised in it, but only loosely because of all of the wibbly-wobbly things going on in terms of English society at the time. He becomes patronized by Queen Elizabeth and the Earl of Leicester. And ultimately, though he's drawn back to the Catholic faith, he ends up in England. Sorry, he ends up, I see somebody is saying, what does this have to do with Saratoga? I was like, we're getting there. So he gets to the continent, and then becomes a Catholic priest, and then he ends up going back to England, taking his life in his hands at this point, because it's illegal. This is a time when they're still killing Catholic priests, executing them. He goes back, disguised as a jewel merchant, and he secretly rides about the country saying masses and offering confessions, etc. And eventually he's captured, and eventually he's taken to London, where he's brought before the Queen and offered a chance to recant, and then he'll be spared and given all kinds of privileges, and he won't do it. And so he's hanged, drawn, and quartered at Tyburn Tree in London. So these are the two Edmunds that this character Edmund is named after, and I let you take it away now.
So after all that, Ned, who is a Catholic recusant, decides to convert to Anglicanism.
Yes.
And I find this to be kind of an interesting dynamic. It's always fascinated me through multiple periods of history that people who are essentially treated as second-class citizens at best, and sometimes much worse than that, still feel a loyalty to the government that is treating them in this way. And Ned squarely falls into that category. We've also seen numerous real-life examples of people who were their families fought the Jacobin revolts and their families were killed and their properties were seized, and yet they became officers in the British Army a generation later. It strikes me that people are willing to end up supporting a government that's treated them so horribly.
Yeah, well, I think for some people it's more about supporting the country. So obviously it depends. Like you said, it's complicated for everybody in these situations. And for some people, like when you say like in the Jacobite rebellions, some people would basically leave, they would go into exile, and they would become mercenaries. Well, I mean, Simon Fraser of Balneen on Burgoyne's top brass staff at Saratoga. There, we're back to Saratoga, people. So Fraser comes from a background, the Highland clans, and the Frasers could be wibbly wobbly themselves in terms of who they were backing when, but you did have a substantial amount of them backed Bonnie Prince Charlie in that revolt. And ultimately, Fraser himself as a teenager ends up as an exile. He goes into exile and ends up on the continent, and he becomes a mercenary for the Dutch. That's how he begins his career. He can't go home, really. So he's there, and he's serving the Dutch, and he does so until the onset of the French and Indian War, when he is allowed to go back to Britain if he will basically take oaths now of allegiance to the House of Hanover and serve in the British Army as an officer of Highlanders. So in a Highland regiment raised for Highlanders. Now, keep in mind, there was a lot of prejudice against Highlanders, especially ones from clans that had been rebel. So this is actually one of the famous things from James Wolfe, is that he had said originally, like, they're no great mischief if they fall. He thought very minimalistically of the Highlanders initially, but something that I think a lot of people when talking about this forget is that he changed. He changed through working with them. And by the end of it, he's singing the praises of the officer corps as like the most manly and gallant he'd ever been around and so forth. And he had this really close bond with the Highlanders, particularly because they really appreciated hands-on leadership. So this was a whole thing. Suffice to say, Fraser was there at Quebec. So he ends up serving the British Army again. He's re-inculcated in with them. The bonding with actually Wolfe helped a lot in terms of Highlanders in that particular campaign feeling like they had a future with this whole thing. Fraser himself goes kind of from strength to strength and breaks glass ceilings because really initially he was not supposed to be serving in any other capacity but simply commanding other Highlanders. You're not supposed to command any other kind of soldier, just Highlanders. Oh, and then it was like very reluctant that the government even agreed to do this with regards to these clans. But anyway, eventually, of course, Fraser, he can't be kept in his place. He rises above it, and he ends up, by the time we meet him at Saratoga, he's commanding all stripes of people. He's become a proper general in the British Army now, and he's doing it all. So I think people had hope in these circumstances. So even if a government had treated them bad initially or something like that, or let's say they were part of a rising against that government or their family were, well, they still thought, okay, but like there were options. I mean, especially with the Jacobite situation, were limited. What were they supposed to do exactly? Like, you could go into exile forever and never come back. That's an option. Some people took that option. Some people actually joined the French army, and you do have Scots from the Jacobite rebellions who actually served, not just Scots either, because the emphasis, I mean, Jacobites were all across the British Isles, but I was just thinking of one particular, the Chevalier St. Johnson, who was St. Johnston, who was serving under Montcalm in the French side of the French and Indian War in the Battle of Quebec. So you had some people who went into exile, served, other powers, continental powers, and then never returned to Britain. But you have others like Fraser who did indeed return to Britain. And I think that part of it was, again, this hope that you could start afresh, that you could be acknowledged by the government in power, and that you could have just a second shot at things. Now, George II was the one that a lot of these people came in, again, ironically, of course. So George II was the king in power when the 45 actually occurred. But then you have a situation where he's still the king during the French and Indian War. So, that's an interesting, tension there. But George III went a great deal in trying to make things easier for everyone because, number one, he was the first Hanoverian king to be born in Britain. He says, I glory in the name of Britain. And he really tried to reach out to former Jacobites and say, okay, things happened, but we're all in this together now. We're all Britons. Let's move on. I'm a new king. It's a new era, a new young king too. He came to the throne quite young. And he says we can move on past this and so forth. And so it was said by one contemporary that he had Scotland without exception. Now there were always exceptions, but that was the point. He largely won over Scotland, George III did, by that attitude he took.
Well, and it seems like George III was the first king to really try to put the whole Catholic thing behind British. It was under his administration or his rule that Catholics were first allowed to join the army, the British Army. And that happened towards the end of the American Revolution, I believe, right?
Well, it did. And the Catholic relief acts that enabled that were directly connected to the aftermath of Saratoga. The Saratoga wipeout was so dramatic that's why they started to discuss Catholics not only joining
recruit in Ireland, I believe, and they were all Catholics.
Right. Well, a lot of them were anyway. I mean, I think this is like an important bit that I try to point out in my story, that a lot of Catholics, majority of Catholics were Irish, especially if they were of either Gaelic or Norman ancestry. But you did also have a significant amount of people who were either of, at this point, like Anglo-Irish ancestry or of like Scotch-Irish ancestry, Welsh-Irish ancestry. There was a mix of people who identified as Irish. If they were in the American Revolutionary era British Army, they would call themselves Irish. They would also call themselves British. These people were they were recruited from Protestant areas of Ireland. So in other words, it was a mix. They did recruit from Protestant areas. They also wanted to recruit from more, Catholic areas. And then you had Catholics who were taking the Test Act, and they were caving, kind of like Ned, and they were just doing it to get in because they believed there was higher opportunities. And there were in some cases. It was a kind of a leg up situation, even though things were hard. It still was an open door to different things. So in the aftermath of Saratoga, you did have this move to grant relief acts to Catholics, both so they could join the military and so that they could inherit land, because of just how many people, especially from landholding classes, had been wiped out during this campaign or fell off the grid or were going to be not coming home for a while. Let's just put it that way. So that was sort of the things that really generated it. And that in turn led to the Gordon riots.
Right. For everybody else, the Gordon riots happened in London. It was a reaction by Protestants against some of the more pro-Catholic legislation that was being considered by Parliament, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of ironic, because being Catholic was kind of a sense of you were probably just going to be disloyal to the king. That was kind of the bias that existed, because Catholic Spain and Catholic France were Britain's greatest enemies at that time. When the American Revolution happened, you had Protestants fighting against the king, which was not what normally happened. And it's kind of ironic that they had to bring in Catholics to help support the king in this rebellion in America by Protestants.
Well, to be fair, there were Protestant revolts against various kings. So, Protestant-led revolts. So, rebels can come in every stripe, and for different reasons. Everybody had, in other words, it's like there was a lot of up and down from the time of Henry's split to the time of the American Revolution. Just all kinds of up and down in terms of the religious situation in Britain and the way that religion and politics overlapped.
Right. But getting back to the book, Ned wants to join Burgoyne on this campaign. He converts to Anglicanism and is given a commission and joins Burgoyne in Canada for what is going to become known as the Saratoga campaign. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Correct.
Just so we all know the background, of course, Burgoyne gets command of this whole campaign basically by going back to Britain and bad-mouthing General Carleton for being too timid and too unwilling to push forward from Canada into New York. Burgoyne basically gives the ministry this great plan where he says he can do it, and where Carleton cannot. And of course, the Secretary of State for American Affairs at this point, Lord Germain, is somebody who absolutely hates General Carleton anyway, for a lot of other reasons that happened years earlier.
Yeah.
So he was more than happy to basically shove Carleton aside and give Burgoyne this plum assignment.
I feel kind of bad for Carleton, because on the one hand, he seems like actually a decent guy. And on the other hand, it seemed like a lot of people did not like him. I remember reading in the letters of Simon Fraser, he couldn't stand Carleton. Now, and he and Burgoyne were pretty close friends. And so he couldn't stand him. He called him the Pharaoh. And it was just like totally like just like I can't wait for this guy to be given the boot from this project so that I can work with you, Johnny. Please. I just can't stand working with this guy. I don't know. I feel rather bad for him, but yeah, a lot of people did not gel with Carlton very well at all.
Well, Carlton does eventually get to become commander in chief in North America. Of
He
course,
does.
by that
He
time,
does.
it's too late to do anything, but
Hey, he gets to wear the badge. I mean, even
yeah.
if it's on, it's a little late to say it's a little late to save the sinking ship, but he got to be the captain.
Ned is joining this campaign that's going to start off in Quebec and supposedly end up in New York City.
Wasn't Hal supposed to meet them in Albany?
Yes. So Howe was supposed to come up from New York City and meet them in Albany, although a lot of them would have probably wound up in New York City, to be fair. A lot of people on the march thought that they were going to end up in NYC eventually.
Well, if you ask General Howe, he never thought he was going to meet them anywhere. But yes, most of the
Yeah.
administration thought he was going to.
He wanted his steaks, his steak subs in Philly, clearly, very badly. The hankering was just too much.
Well, this whole campaign seems to me to be a failure because of a clash of egos more than anything else. You had the whole Germain Carleton fight, and then you also had the fact that Burgoyne was kind of a more junior upstart general, and Howe felt threatened by the fact that Burgoyne was given this chance to become a hero, essentially, and that Howe was going to be just sitting there in New York, essentially doing nothing but waiting to receive him. And so Howe felt the need to go off after Washington and Pennsylvania because he needed to prove that he could do something besides sit in the city and wait for Burgoyne to arrive.
Yeah, it was very much of an ego battle. And you see so much of the same with regards to the Continental Army ego struggles going on, and the revolutionary, military commanders were just as wonky this way.
At the same time, Burgoyne was bad-mouthing Carleton in England. You had Horatio Gates bad-mouthing Philip Schuyler in Philadelphia. So,
oh yeah, it was what it is. It's men in power. I mean, honestly, like the power can go to their heads really, really easily. It's just one of those things that just one ego move begets an opposite reaction ego move, and everybody is trying to be like the solo hero of the day, and it's just one of those things that very easily can jettison projects. I will say this, though. I don't think that, yes, Howe not coming really, really, really was bad for the campaign. At the same time, there was a lot of other things that were going wrong. So, I mean, I would say that a lot of stuff that was happening with regards to Burgoyne's assessment of the ground was not that great. His expectation for allies among the Indians and the Loyalists and what he thought they could do for him got very, very questionable as things went on. It got iffier and iffier as it went, and things started to go very, very wrong, especially with the Indians. Things he should have, but he did not expect to hang him up, did hang him up. And there was just so many different things that started to turn it into basically nightmare fuel for the British as this went on, which is one of the things I actually always found very compelling about the campaign. It has this very kind of wilderness folk horror vibe to it as things start to just absolutely careen off the tracks. Point being, it wasn't just Howe that killed this thing. It was a lot of different things that killed it, but Howe certainly, I think, put the nail in the coffin.
Well, even if Howe had gone to Albany, Burgoyne never got anywhere close to Albany.
Well, I think that Burgoyne wanted him to come up further at a certain point.
Well, as he got more and more desperate, sure.
Right. In other words, he was looking for, he was in the very latter phases of toastedness. So he needed some help immediately or he was, doomed. So that was kind of what was happening there. But I'm just saying that, he does deserve blame, but I don't think solely blame. It is everybody deserves some blame on that account.
Yeah, I mean, a big part of this was just bad intelligence, really. Burgoyne was under the understanding that if he went through upstate New York and showed the flag, so to speak, that the
did not understand something. The poor man did not understand New York State.
No.
I mean, this is a common mistake. This is a common mistake. I have relatives all over the New Jersey, New York states areas, and I'm just like, yeah, buddy, you don't understand what New York State is. You're clearly making that mistake people make, where they think it's the Big Apple or something, and it's like, oh, there's just like some, little bit of countryside around it. And it's like, yeah, oh, my man, no. So yeah.
Yeah, he expected, and this was kind of their expectation everywhere they went, is that if the British regulars showed up, the Tories would turn out and support them. By the time Burgoyne started moving into upstate New York, most of the Tories had been chased out of the state, and he did not get
or
the
were too scared to do anything, to be honest. Like, so you basically had, some did turn out, and I do feature them in my trilogy, but
but
then a lot of them did, not to the numbers, not near to the numbers that he expected or was going to need. That's the reality of it.
Well, the first thing they did was capture Ticonderoga, and everybody in England thought, great, we've won the campaign at that point.
Yeah, they overestimated that, because Ticonderoga, it didn't only just have strategic significance and being good for access to supplies and all the rest of it, it had all this symbolic quality. I mean, when you think about how much British blood went into the attempts to take Ticonderoga when it was Carillon, when it was the French fort.
During the French and Indian War, that was a really...
French and Indian War. Very much so. I mean, with the whole stakes, pointed stakes and everything that the French had erected. And the loss...
Their brother was killed.
Yes! There we go. We both had a mind meld, right? So no, because I love Lord George Augustus Howe. I wrote a lengthy poem for him one time. So anyway, suffice to say,
he actually died in the arms of Israel Putnam.
Yes,
Continental general.
It's just like, some of these things are like the twists of irony are just so massive. It's just kind of like, I mean, Howe, as in Lord George Augustus, was just a really, really interesting character, because it was said he was beloved and feared by everyone who served under him, be they regular or provincial. He was very interesting as a person. He was a nobleman. He comes from this high birth and background, and yet at the same time, he's very, very down to earth with people. He had a good rapport with people. He was a good person to build bridges between different parts of the British Empire and their military entity. And so he was the one who everyone thought was going to be the great hero of the age. He was the one who was supposed to be Wolfe. And the fact that he got killed the way he did so suddenly shocked everyone, including Wolfe. We have these wonderful letters from Wolfe where he's just like, I can't believe it. He was supposed to be. Where will we find his equal? And it's amazing when you start to think about the irony of the situation, being that Wolfe, of course, is going to become the legend, the legend of his age. So the point is, the symbolic value of Ticonderoga is connected to Lord Howe and to so many other Britons who were killed trying to take it. So that in and of itself, in addition to the practical reasons why it was a big deal, meant so much for them to get it back. And we have that famous anecdote of General Phillips saying, where a goat can go, a man can go, and where a man can go, he can drag a gun. So, it really was a high point for the campaign and for their spirits in general. I don't think people realized, again, especially long distance, just how much they had to go afterwards. It was almost like, oh, they've won. It's like, yeah, but they're not near where they need to be in order to actually win this thing.
That's where things really began to unravel. I mean, first you had Barry St. Leger, which was supposed to take Fort Stanwix. Benedict Arnold almost single-handedly forced that retreat on his own. Essentially, he sent a deserter back to Fort Stanwix, basically made him tell the army that Arnold was coming with an entire army. All the Indian allies fled, and most of the loyalist militia fled, and eventually the British regulars that were with St. Leger also had to flee. So Arnold pretty much took that fort by himself personally.
Oh, yeah. Arnold was a very active participant there in the Saratoga campaign. And of course, the lack of recognition he felt he got was part of his excuse for some of the later things that he did. So, yeah, that was definitely interesting in terms of his presence there and his kind of type A I mean, a lot of these guys were type A, good Lord.
Sure.
But, you know, he definitely had a very type A personality.
And then, of course, the militia that turned out, the New York and New England militia that turned out, they basically formed a huge delaying action that prevented
Yeah.
the movement of the British Army. They flooded forests, they felled trees across
Oh,
roads,
yeah.
let
Sabotage. They sabotaged them,
dead animals
basically.
everywhere.
Yeah.
Right. And the British Army had to move wagons through this. They couldn't just march through forests. They had to move a lot of wagons with supplies and stuff, and they just couldn't do it. They were running out of food and everything else by the time they got down to
It was
Sarah.
a bogged down mess at a certain point. It was the difficulties that they were going to have to overcome in order to get from point A to point B. You know, were just such that, again, that's why I'm saying how is not the only problem here. There was a lot of problems, and I feel like the plan should not have been greenlit. It really should not have been greenlit. People should have looked at this and said, you know what? Maybe we should try to come up with another plan, because this one just sounds, it's such a Johnny production. Good Lord. I mean, this is a man who wanted to do Shakespeare musicals. Everyone should be aware that he wanted to do that and then say, okay, we're going to let theater kid here do this. Maybe no, maybe no.
Yeah, don't put the drama students in charge. Sorry.
No, please don't.
A more experienced, more conservative general, after taking Ticonderoga, probably would have stopped there. But
Yes.
Burgoyne had said he was going to be the brave man who pushed forward against all odds and made it all the way.
This is somebody who eventually is going to translate a bunch of romances, French language romances about Richard the Lionheart. So he wanted, I mean, ironically, he in many ways was similar to Richard the Lionheart when you think about a commander who is very beloved by his men, is very physically brave, puts his body where the danger is, and is very, very set upon his goal, almost like a holy mission, like a crusade, and is determined that he will be the one to swing destiny, that he is riding a wave of destiny, essentially. And then ends up as a prisoner, and doesn't end up capturing the city that they're trying to capture. So the parallels are amazing. The fact that he ends up translating these Richard the Lionheart things and sort of adapting them into a play is just amazing to me. But it really is a situation where, as we were saying, other people would have said, you know, maybe we shouldn't do this. Well, he had people saying maybe we shouldn't do this. I mean, among them General Fraser, before the final disastrous battle where Fraser is mortally wounded, he is saying, no, we shouldn't do this. Pretty much everyone is saying, no, we shouldn't do this. So, I mean, Burgoyne, he is going into what I can only call manic phase. He's manically driven to do this Britons never retreat thing, which is nonsense. Britons have retreated up and down their history all the time, but apparently for him right now, he's more or less saying, I will not retreat. I refuse to retreat. And that's why it's the great Shakespearean tragedy of this whole thing. I mean, I always think of it, it's like Johnny could not have created a better play in terms of a Shakespearean or Arthurian even tragedy. I mean, he literally enacts it, right down to poor Fraser getting mortally wounded while trying to hold the line against the odds, you know, basically inordinately targeted by, you know, telling
Morgan's
the
right.
marksman.
So the book essentially, this first book ends with around the surrender of Saratoga, correct?
No.
No.
No. So the first book does not. So the first book ends about midway through the Saratoga campaign.
Oh, okay.
Remember, we spent a whole half of this book in England talking about all of the stuff that I talked about, and everyone was saying, what is she doing? So that's the first half of this book. The second half of this book is the Saratoga campaign. And so what we do cover, though, well, first of all, if we want to cover what are the Revolutionary War bits of this book? Okay, so we cover meeting characters who are in it, like Gage and Pitcairn, and obviously spending time with Burgoyne, getting to know them a lot. We meet the king, we meet Percy, we meet a bunch of people. Then we learn of what's going on, both from newspapers, but also from Ned getting letters from Burgoyne, who's in Boston, and then ultimately in Canada. And so we learn all of the sort of catch-up things that are going on in the colonies through that. Then we eventually get where Ned and the others go to Canada to set up for the Saratoga campaign. And then, you know, we meet Fraser and Phillips and the rest of the gang. And then they finally do go south and they start with the march, and we cover various aspects of the day-to-day experience, and we follow Ned's journey onward. His journey starts to take new shapes, especially when he meets Abigail Vandekamp. This is when it's a big changing point, because she is, this patriot girl. Her father was imprisoned on a British prison hulk because he was printing propaganda pamphlets and writings and so forth. So the British put him in a prison hulk. She becomes the victim of basically war crimes, essentially, and just has a terrible time of it, terrible experience of it. And she's desperate to try to save her father's life. And so she is willing to basically sell herself to British officers to try and get a deal cut to save her father. She's in a terribly desperate position. And so this is how she ends up, trying to pitch herself to Burgoyne, essentially. He's a ladies' man. And then ultimately Burgoyne sort of passes her off to Ned. And because Ned already broke, this is the thing, he's got deep internal issues in terms of his feelings about what he has done, taking this test act to go on the campaign. He feels really bad about it. He didn't really ever change his mind about his faith. He simply kind of cast it aside in order to, he felt, be a true Englishman. But he's deeply conflicted. Then he runs into Abby, who has this whole experience that he hasn't, as of yet, had that kind of an intimate contact with. And at first, it sort of just, it ends up being a very, very awkward, hormonally driven one-night stand. He feels very weird and kind of terrible about it, honestly. And then he's kind of trying to bond with her somehow because he feels so weird about what's gone down. And eventually they do actually end up in a mutually emotionally bonded kind of Stockholm Syndrome relationship, is the best way of putting it. But over the course of the story, he learns a lot about, and we as an audience learn a lot about, the Patriot point of view and their perspective on what's gone down and what's been going down. And over time, she starts to try and kind of lure him towards her side a bit, so that adds more complexity to the mix. We also meet some other Patriot characters in book one as well, including one who's a part of what could be termed now like the Black Robe Regiment, but basically these preachers who did get very involved in trying to rally their congregations into the Patriot cause, because when they would go off and they would essentially fight with their congregations. And so we meet one of them. We meet a sniper, actually, a marksman who's been mortally wounded, and get a little bit with him. Actually, now I think about it, another attempted marksman we also interact with, who gets executed eventually. We also meet people who are more on the border of things, like Quakers. They're pacifists, and they're caught in the middle of this. We get to meet a lot of different groups of people. So that's what it is. That's why it takes as long as it does, really, the story. It's meant to be kind of like a slow burn slice of life in a lot of ways, a slice of life in this period and what somebody on the Saratoga campaign might encounter, and who they might encounter. Sort of, that's the whole point. The name of this series is All Ye That Pass By. So the idea is sort of you're seeing all of these different characters and their different perspectives as they pass by, as you're going through this sort of journey / pilgrimage in Ned's case. We do end up getting to Ticonderoga. We get to the capture of Ticonderoga. We also get to the Jane McCrae incident, where, of course, McCrae is killed, and there's all this dispute about, well, did the Indian allies of the British kill her, or was it an accident? And it's all of this controversy, but it is certainly used as a propaganda piece by Gates and his Patriots. So we cover all of that. Book one ends not long after the Jane McCrae incident. And then it picks up in the next book, in book two, where Ned, who has been on Burgoyne's staff, I don't want to give away too much of what the ending of book one is, but basically in book one, he was on Burgoyne's staff, but something happens which causes him to have to be moved off of that staff. And so he ends up on General Fraser's staff, and he's there for more than half of book two. And so book two ends right as, just to show you how much, like, book two is a little amount of time compared to book one, a little amount of time, but it's chock packed of stuff happening. But he basically ends up at the end of book two, right at the brink of the surrender. So that's how packed it is, even though it's a small amount of time. And then the third book is basically the finalization of the surrender and the aftermath for Ned and various other characters and various other things. I mean, we're going to actually follow him to a number of other locations where he's going to meet a few other people, historical people, including Major Andre actually starts to become an important character in book 3. Major Patrick Ferguson shows up. We get the Nestor Tarleton. We get Lord Rowden. So we get to meet other people, and then we do wrap around to ultimately what happens with regards to the Catholic Relief Acts and the fallout that results in the Gordon riots. So that's all book 3. So that's the general vibe of the thing.
Oh, we are running a little late here. I did want to open up if anybody has any questions or comments or thoughts.
Sure. Did you want to read? Because I see them flashing up to me questions and things, or comments, but I can't, I wasn't able to read them. Do you want to read them to me?
Question: Quakers have a rather interesting history of being pacifists or not depending on what is most convenient under the circumstances. Sure what you're asking there.
I'm not sure. So you mean were Quakers doing what was convenient under the circumstances by being pacifists, or are you saying that they weren't doing what was convenient by sticking to their guns, so to speak, in a very opposite way right there?
Well, I mean, we see pacifists going in very different directions. I mean, some of them actually essentially give up their religion and become soldiers. I mean,
well, then they're not Quakers anymore, are they?
Nathaniel Green is an example of that, right? They give up being Quaker.
Well, he's not. See, Nathaniel Green is no longer a Quaker. He's a fallen away Quaker, so I don't think he really counts. But actually, practicing Quakers, if they really stick to their convictions, they're not going to do anything like he did.
Quakers are not only pacifists; they believe in the divine right of kings. They believe that if somebody is king, they're king because God put them there, and it's not their place to.
Well, they believe in it's not their place. I mean, I don't think they believe in the divine right of kings per se. That's a very specific term. The divine right of kings is extremely specific.
I've read some interesting writings by Quakers at the time.
Oh no, maybe some, but I'm just saying, I don't know about because they had a kind of a they wouldn't, for example, bow to people in authority. They wouldn't use honorifics.
Right.
So they weren't quite divine right of kings. That's a little bit different. But I would say you're right about the fact. I get what you're going for. You were right about the fact that they certainly didn't believe it was their place to upseat people in authority. That's true. They were opposed to that. And so it was actually more common for Quakers to be neutral, so to speak, not pacifist, but leaning loyalist, because they didn't typically believe in rebellion. That having been said, you did have Quakers who remained Quakers in good standing, who leaned patriot. So, they leaned sympathetic to whatever patriot arguments or complaints for why they were having issues with the British government, but they still didn't sort of pull a Green. They still remained pacifists, but they did sympathize with the arguments or whatnot being made by patriots. So
somebody asked, where is your book available?
On Amazon. You can look up All Ye That Pass By, Gone for a Soldier. So it's like the folk song, Johnny Has Gone for a Soldier, and look up my name, which is my name is not the easiest thing to pronounce or spell. It's Avelina Bellestri. And so you can look that up.
Yeah, I will certainly include not only your name, but a direct link to the book, when I post this online, so people will be able to see that at that point.
Are all 3 books available?
No, only the first one is published. So
okay.
The other 2 are in the works. I do have other published books, though. I have one set in the basically 12th century England, and
I can see that. You're also a musician, a songwriter, I think.
I am. Yes, in fact, I've done a number of songs pertaining to historical characters from the 18th century, from this time period. So
nice.
Thank you.
You have a planned date for book 2's release?
I don't want to put too much pressure on myself, but I'll say I'm doing my best at it. I am writing out of order, so I have to get a proper sense of movement. I will say that I've written a lot of the major drama sequences. So one of the most important sequences is going to be Simon Fraser's death. So as I was saying earlier, he gets kind of inordinately targeted by way of Arnold saying, I do not wish to see him long, which always kind of cracked me up in the worst kind of way. I'm just like, what kind of a way is to say that about someone? I don't want to. But anyway, this is such an Arnold way of saying that. So Fraser is told by his aides, you're being inordinately targeted, and he refuses to get down from his horse or to back up and says, my duty forbids it. And then he dies an excruciatingly long death in the women's quarters because he got his internal organs horrendously torn up. And he famously kind of groans, oh, fatal ambition, poor General Burgoyne, my poor wife. So it's kind of like the eulogy of the campaign in many ways. But so I dramatized that in book 2, and that's all been written. And that part is all done.
Someone asks what your thoughts are on the show Turn, AMC's Turn, I guess. Have you seen it? I'm just guessing.
Oh, no. Okay, I'm going to try to fight to limit myself in commentary a lot. Okay, so just suffice to say, what the heck did they do to Major Andre? Just what the heck? I mean, what? They literally have him be like, I'm not dying for king and country. No, I'm dying for a woman, which destroys Andre, destroys him completely. I mean, this is a man who said, because I'm suffering for my country, my king and country, I must count this as the most glorious of my life while he's on the scaffold. But, we're going to put that in the garbage disposal. No, it was for some chick who dumped him in Philly. Now, in reality, yeah, he dated Peggy for a little while. He dated tons of people for a little while. Andre was very much of a, mover in social circles. So that just was...
Even when he was in Philly, he was seeing lots of other women. Peggy was not his lead dance card.
No. He was totally... Well, okay, thank you. Nathan Hale payback. So point here, I'm going to go on another tangent. Oh my gosh, am I going to go on another tangent? I truly cannot bear the sort of thing where it's kind of like, we're punishing Andre for Hale, and there's this weird association in people's minds that Andre had something to do with Hale's demise because he was on Howe's staff for a little while. He wasn't on Howe's staff at the time when... he wasn't on Howe's staff at the time when Hale was killed, okay? He had, not only that, he was actually a prisoner of war during that time. He had nothing to do with Hale's death, and the association of him being somehow a revenge kill for Hale's death is just stupid. But anyway, so, yeah. But anyway, so that's a whole thing I can go into because, it is very, I think it was very true that they did perceive it as a payback for Nathan Hale, especially with Benjamin Talmadge, with his whole, hey, did you ever hear of Nathan Hale? And yours is the exact same case. And Andre's like, yeah, but it's not. It's like, yeah, it is. It's like, well, no, categorically, even looking at it, is a different case. Had some similarities, but there was also major differences. So no, they're not the same case. And Andre was not really directly connected to Hale's death at all, but just because it was very much of a revenge, not only for Hale but for Arnold.
They killed one of ours, we killed one of theirs, right?
Exactly that, and because of trying to get back at Arnold as well.
And that was the main. Andre suffered because they couldn't put their hands on Arnold.
Arnold did not care. It was so stupid. It was like, okay, we're gonna kill you because Arnold will not care at all. Okay. It was crazy. I will say I greatly enjoy getting to write Major Andre because I feel like a lot of the times he gets reduced to this being doomed spy guy or doomed romantic figure or doomed. I like Andre because he was an artsy guy, and I'm an artsy person, and I feel like I would have got on awesomely with Andre. And not only that, he was, from stories we know about him, he was a genuinely decent guy. He was, there's one little anecdote I just feel like sharing now that I've gone on that tangent, which was told by this person who had been a teenager, in 14 or 15, at the time of the American Revolution. And he and his brother had thrown in very quickly with a militia body and ended up getting captured by the British and were about to be put into a British prison hulk. And one of them, the youngest one, starts to panic because, you go into prison hulks, you don't typically come out, or at least your percentage is pretty low. So he starts having a panic attack. And then as he's having this panic attack, somebody, a young officer, British officer, comes over to him and takes him by the hand and calms him down and tells him to man up, pull yourself together, but also gets the kid to talk for a few minutes. And he says that he's so distressed because he knows his mother and his family will never see him again, and the fact that he was just happy with them earlier that day. So the young British officer says, well, pull yourself together, don't cry anymore. And then he says to the guards, wait, don't do anything with these two until I come back. So he goes, and then when he comes back, he says very cheerfully, I have good news. I have good news for you. You've been turned over to me to do with as I please. And I would be pleased if you ran away. So he lets them go. He gives them this is according to the kids' story in the aftermath. He gives them this interesting little sermon of sorts in which he essentially says to them, go on, go back home, go home, fear God, love one another, be, obedient to your parents, and, basically follow the commandments, and God will bless you. And that's what they remember from it. And of course, this young officer was Andre. And it makes sense, too, because Andre was raised in a very piously Huguenot household. So it ties in very appropriately, and it ties into another thing, which is that after he'd been hanged, they found within his coat, written in his own handwriting, a hymn called Hail Sovereign Love, which the first line of it is, Hail Sovereign Love that first began the scheme to rescue fallen man. Hail matchless, free, eternal grace that gave my soul a hiding place. It's all of these things that make me love Andre, and it's all of these things that hardly ever make it into TV or movies or novel portrayals of him, and that's what I'm kind of trying my best to do when I'm portraying him. I'm portraying him as a person, and some of the aspects of him that I actually find more interesting and appealing and worthy of remembrance.
What is your favorite revolution location that you have visited?
Probably Kings Mountain. Okay. It's a very, very haunting spot. I'm also, not to go down the deep, deep tunnel again, but I'm also quite interested in Major Patrick Ferguson. I've read a lot of his personal correspondence. Yeah. So it's quite moving once you've done that, and once you've gone that far, to be standing in front of someone's grave, with that headstone with the lion and the unicorn on it, and all of the kind of just history and heritage and sort of drama and tragedy of the spot for him. And it definitely was very moving. And when I was there, I ended up actually, it was like, it was starting to just drizzle when I got there too. So it added to the sense of sort of hauntedness. And I got there and I wound up singing this Gaelic lament in front of the grave. So I have this, memory of it very keenly. And then when I got home, I ended up writing a song about it. So that's actually on my YouTube channel called Ferguson's Grave. And it integrates the Gaelic lament in as well. So that's a memory I have from that location.
Avelina Balestri, I really thank you for coming on and talking about your book and sharing your thoughts and opinions about all this stuff. I think it's been a great talk. And
thank you so much. I greatly appreciate being on as well. And also, if anybody has like questions that I didn't get around to answer, by all means, feel free to just contact me on Facebook. I'm very available. So send me a message, friend me. I'm very available.
Yes, Andre was a Huguenot. He can't be that bad after all.
Is the person who asked that question a Huguenot?
Yeah.
It sounds like someone is Huguenot in the chat.
Just a Calvinist.
What's that?
I hear a voice.
I'm just a Calvinist, which is close enough.
It is indeed. So, you get to, I mean, so that would mean that you'd also see, I've just been actually editing a section with Major Pitcairn, and he came from Covenanter background. His father was a chaplain for the Cameronian regiment during the War of Spanish Succession under Marlborough, and they were the basically spiritual descendants, essentially, of the Covenanters in Scotland. So more Calvinists for you.
I always find it funny that my mother's family got kicked out of France for being Huguenots. My father's family got essentially kicked out of Ireland for being Catholic. So
there you go. It's the cycle. May the circle be unbroken and all that.
chased out on both sides.
It never ends.
It
Yeah.
never, it's the song that doesn't end.
All right. Thanks so much, Avelina. We'll
Thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate it. God bless.
all right. Goodbye, all. Remember, we'll be here again next week or next month, I'm sorry, with another talk. If there's something in particular subject you want to discuss, let me know. Otherwise, I'll come up with something. Thanks again to Avelina for joining us tonight. All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Once again, thank you for joining our discussion about the book Gone for a Soldier, the first book in the trilogy All Ye That Pass By. You can find the book on Amazon, and as always, I've included direct links to the book in my show notes. The author, Avelina Balestri, is also very active on Facebook and welcomes you to interact with her there. As always, thank you for joining us for this podcast, and I hope you will join us next week as we return to a regular episode of the American Revolution podcast.